Today I want to answer a question that I've been asking myself for quite a while. How did the original Neo Geo Pocket end up in Mexico? Alright, so before we begin, I want to make one thing clear. This video is largely speculative. There isn't a definite historical record explaining exactly what happened, so everything you're about to hear is based on the evidence I've personally collected, along with the best conclusions I can draw from that evidence. So with that out of the way, you might already be thinking, wait a minute, the Neo Geo Pocket wasn't even released in North America. So how could it have ended up in Mexico? Interestingly enough, that assumption isn't even entirely true. Although the original monochrome Neo Geo Pocket never received a traditional retail release in the United States, SNK actually managed to sell exactly 2 units in America through a mail order promotion before discontinuing the system in favor of releasing the Neo Geo Pocket Color. We'll come back to that later. First, let's take a look at the history of the system itself. The original Neo Geo Pocket launched in Japan on October 28, 1998, releasing alongside 6 launch titles. 3 more games followed before the end of the year, including one that I'll be covering in my next video, so be sure to subscribe if you'd like to see that. So, unfortunately for SNK, their timing couldn't have been worse. Just 1 week earlier, on October 21st, 1998, Nintendo had released the Game Boy Color. Not only was Nintendo's handheld already in full color, but also launched at 68,000 yen, while the Neo Geo Pocket cost 78,000 yen. So here comes SNK entering the market a week late with only 6 games, a monochrome display, and at a higher price than its biggest competitor. Meanwhile, Nintendo offered a full-colored handheld with backwards compatibility and a massive existing library. Because of this, SNK had to react quickly if they wanted any chance of competing. Less than 5 months later, in March 1999, they released the Neo Geo Pocket Color in Japan, effectively ending the original system's incredibly short lifespan. Because the original monochrome model was sold for such a limited period in Japan, received only a small European release, and had an almost non-existent release in the United States through mail order only, it has become a fairly expensive collectible today. Although SNK never released official production numbers, it's estimated that only around 52,000 monochrome Neo Geo Pocket systems were ever sold. Compare that to roughly 2 million Neo Geo Pocket Color systems that were sold, and those estimates make sense. The original handheld simply wasn't available for very long. With numbers like these, you'd expect to occasionally find one in Japan or Europe. You certainly wouldn't expect to find one in Mexico, and yet that's exactly where my story begins. So a few years ago, while browsing Google for Neo Geo Pocket Color games, I ran across this website app called Mercado Libre, essentially Latin America's equivalent of Mercari or OfferUp. I was searching for Neo Geo Pocket Color games when I saw a variant of a label that I had never seen before. At first I wasn't all that surprised because there are several different label types for Neo Geo Pocket Color games. If you're not familiar with the different label types, for Neo Geo Monochrome there are 2 variants. There's going to be Japanese as well as the European. For Neo Geo Pocket Color, there are 3 different types: Japan, European, as well as the American labels. So these cartridges actually matched none of the variants that I'd seen in the past. Normally counterfeit cartridges are fairly easy to identify because the artwork is stretched, pixelated, or generally just poorly reproduced, but these weren't. The artwork was actually very crisp. The logos looked pretty consistent with original placement for Neo Geo Pocket games. Every label sort of followed the same overall design language, almost as if they had been professionally produced. So that made me kind of wonder, if these were fake, why would someone go through all the trouble to create completely new labels instead of just simply copying the existing label design? Then I noticed something else. Another listing actually showed a blister pack that looked very similar to the packaging from when SNK was liquidating the Neo Geo Pocket Color at the end of its lifespan during the Aru's takeover. If you're not familiar with that period of SNK's history, there are already several great videos covering it, so I won't go too deeply into that here. So after finding that, I kept looking at different listings on the website. I found another pretty unusual listing. So this listing had a complete in-box Japanese Neo Geo Pocket, and it was also bundled with a copy of King of Fighters R2, and it also included what looks like a companion sleeve with artwork matching the game itself, and all the writing on that was in English, and it also had an ESRB rating. So seeing the ESRB rating was very important, and that's something that we'll discuss later, but with seeing all that, I had no choice but to try and make a purchase through this website. Unfortunately, with Mercado Libre, it requires a Latin American address in order to make a purchase, so I had to reach out to someone I knew in Mexico who was able to help me buy a few things off the website. So once everything finally arrived, I had to open up the cartridges and look for myself to see whether or not they were real. And actually, to my surprise, they did appear to be genuine SNK cartridges. There was one cartridge that wasn't actually what it appeared to be, and that was King of Fighters R2. What was interesting about that was it actually contained King of Fighters R1 inside, which I believe is a lot rarer of a game, so it seems kind of unusual that they would swap that out, especially if it had been counterfeit. So because with that game in particular, King of Fighters R1, they included all regions for the languages on the game itself, so I'm not really sure which region it initially came from. It could be American, it could be Japanese. Hey guys, one quick edit. I noticed while filming this that my Pac-Man cartridge actually is a counterfeit, so you'll see that here in a second, but yeah, I'd never checked it before, so now I know. That might add a new layer to this video. But now back to the real question. Why were these systems and cartridges showing up in Mexico in the first place? The first thing I noticed was that with every game I tested, aside from the unusual King of Fighters cartridge, it all ran perfectly in color when I tested it on the Neo Geo Pocket Color. That actually made sense to me because most Neo Geo Pocket Color games are compatible with the original monochrome hardware. Second of all the games that I purchased weren't initially released on the monochrome system. They were released on the Pocket Color. After looking at the cartridges themselves, each one appeared to have the ESRB label, which is initially why I bought it. The ESRB rating, again, that's only necessary when you're releasing something in America, because the other regions don't require, or at least the other regions at the time didn't require the ESRB label. That was only a North American thing. Other regions didn't have a rating system as far as I know at the time. But if you wanted to release in North America, you needed to have that rating system. So outside of that, another pretty consistent detail I noticed in these loose cartridges was the condition. They all had pretty significant wear. They all showed some obvious signs of water damage. And it wasn't just the loose cartridges I bought. It seems like every loose cartridge I could find on this website had pretty similar condition. I tried to find the best ones I could, but they were all looking pretty rough. So aside from the cartridges, the blister pack is a little bit of a different story. Unlike the cartridges, the packaging is actually all in Spanish. It's pretty similar to the blister packaging that we saw at the end of the Neo Geo Pocket Color's lifespan. You can tell it's from a different company though. I'm not sure who produced this blister package, because the one we saw at the end of the Neo Geo Pocket Color's lifespan was produced by eplayplay.com. And one other weird thing about this blister pack, as you can tell, it has a place for 3 games, but for some reason they decided to only include 1 game in the blister pack. So with all that being mentioned, here's kind of the theory that makes the most sense to me. After rushing out the Neo Geo Pocket Color to market to try and keep up with what Nintendo was doing with the Game Boy Color, SNK suddenly had a whole warehouse full of these unsold black and white Neo Geo Pockets. My theory is that they initially had planned a proper Western release, maybe alongside the Pocket Color. The only problem that I could foresee with a release like this is market confusion and maybe SNK competing with themselves, and obviously having to release the Pocket at a discounted price, therefore giving consumers the option to spend less money on their software. So I think that would potentially explain why the new labels were created, to not only remove anything that says color from the label, but also they needed to help differentiate these games from games that could only work with the monochrome system versus the games that could also work with the Pocket system. Because as you may know, there are some color games that won't work with the Pocket. This was actually an issue that Nintendo was having with some of their black cartridges for the Game Boy Color. A lot of consumers had no idea that they not only worked on the original system, but would also play in full color on the Game Boy Color. So maybe SNK was trying to get ahead of that with changing the labels and also displaying the Color Pocket logo in the bottom right corner. Another thing with these specific cartridges, they all supported both English and Japanese, with the one exception being Pac-Man. So if SNK wanted to pull from already existing inventory, they could really pick Japanese, American, European, and just swap the labels out, with the consumer being none the wiser. But again, I think maybe the plans might have changed internally and SNK decided to not release the monochrome unit to North America, clearly, since we never got it. And again, SNK was left with this warehouse full of these monochrome units. And now, on top of that, all these games with the new labels. So, we know, given what happened with the Neo Geo Pocket Color, that SNK was never really that shy when it came to liquidating any excess stock they may have had. We saw that with the blister packs. We saw that with some cartridges showing up on eBay. I was actually able to purchase Facele on eBay for about $15, I think in the mid-2000s. That was a game that never received an official American release, so not exactly sure how it ended up on eBay. So they may have done the same thing, just sold to a distributor who happened to be in Mexico. And I think that may answer the question as to why it is these units ended up in Mexico. I think someone reached out to SNK, or SNK was doing a big liquidation sale somewhere, and whoever purchased this big liquidation must have been operating in Mexico. And that definitely explains the blister pack. Now, as far as the cartridges themselves, the loose cartridges, there is one included in the blister pack which matches the loose cartridge that I found. It's not damaged in the same way, fortunately, because it was in that blister pack, but I think the reason that so many of these loose cartridges were damaged in such a way that they were damaged may have in part been due to the weather that Mexico had been receiving around that time. So in the late 90s, Mexico had been hit with tropical storms, with hurricanes. I think Hurricane Isis hit in 1998. And then next year, I think it was around October in 1999, parts of Mexico experienced severe tropical storms. There was one tropical depression that combined the moisture from a cold front and produced nearly a year's worth of rainfall only in a few days. So to see the type of water damage on these cartridges really isn't a surprise. I'm guessing that there may have been a warehouse full of these, and maybe they got hit by the tropical storm. Another thing I noticed was a lot of the Pocket units that I've come across, the original monochrome Pockets, have some pretty severe screen burn, although that could just simply be the result of age. So that was another thing I noticed. I do have one unit that has pretty severe screen burn, but the other Pocket I have, which may have been in another blister pack, since the blister pack I have has the same unit, that may be why it doesn't have the same kind of wear. I'm not sure. So, in conclusion, without any official documentation, we'll probably never truly know exactly what happened, how these units made their way south of the border, but based on all the evidence I have, the unique labels, the ESRB, the artwork, the Spanish blister packaging, the fact that they are genuine SNK cartridges, the weird distribution patterns, and just how consistent the condition of each game is, how they're all damaged in the same way. This is the best explanation I could come up with, but I would love to know what you guys think. So, do you guys have any other theories as to how the Neo Geo Pocket landed in Mexico? I'd love to see what you guys think, so be sure to leave a comment below if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the weirder things in my collection. Be sure to leave a like. If you enjoy videos like this, be sure to subscribe. I'm going to try and put out a new video every week. But anyways, thanks for staying to the end, and I hope to see you in the next one.